"That's the wrong trick," said the new cashier to the Millionaire CEO, seconds before the 200-minute deal. The coffee shop was nearly empty at 6:47 a.m. when Marcus Chen, CEO of TechVault Industries, walked through the glass doors expecting his usual perfectly timed triple espresso. What he got instead was a collision course with destiny, packaged in the form of a 23-year-old cashier named Sophie Martinez, who was about to tell one of the most powerful men in Silicon Valley that he was doing magic tricks wrong. Marcus had built his empire on precision. Every movement calculated, every decision data-driven, every morning identical to the last. For 15 years, he'd arrived at this exact coffee shop at this exact time, ordered the same drink, performed the same coin trick for whoever was behind the counter, a little sleight of hand he'd learned from his grandfather, and left $100 bill as a tip before heading to his corner office 3 blocks away. It was his ritual, his way of staying grounded before diving into the cutthroat world of corporate acquisitions and billion-dollar negotiations. But today, his regular barista wasn't there. Instead, Sophie stood behind the counter, her first day on the job, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to remember which button made a triple espresso versus a regular one. She'd taken this minimum wage position out of desperation, having dropped out of her neuroscience PhD program 6 months earlier when her mother's cancer treatment bills became insurmountable. Her dreams of breakthrough research had been replaced by the reality of survival. One coffee order at a time. If you're enjoying this story so far, please hit that like button, drop a comment below telling me what you think will happen next. Share this with someone who needs inspiration today, and subscribe to Trillionaire in Love for more powerful stories that will change how you see success and human connection. Now let's continue. Marcus approached the counter with his usual confident stride, barely glancing up from his phone where the final details of today's crucial merger were being hammered out. $200 million hung in the balance. The deal would be signed at 9 a.m. sharp, and it would cement TechVault's position as the dominant force in cybersecurity. Everything was perfectly aligned just as he'd planned. Triple espresso, extra hot, he said without looking up, then added as an afterthought, "Watch this." He pulled out a quarter and began his grandfather's coin trick, the one that made it appear to vanish behind his ear and reappear in his other hand. It was smooth, practiced, something he could do in his sleep. Sophie looked up from the espresso machine, watched his hands move, and said something that nobody had ever said to Marcus Chen in his entire adult life. "That's the wrong trick." Marcus froze mid-motion, the quarter suspended between his fingers. He looked at her fully for the first time, this young woman with dark circles under her eyes and coffee grounds on her green apron. "Excuse me?" Sophie's face flushed red. She couldn't believe the words had left her mouth. This man was clearly important. His $1,000 suit and titanium watch screamed power, and here she was on her first day, contradicting him about something as stupid as a magic trick. But something in his performance had triggered a memory so vivid and painful that the words had escaped before she could stop them. "I'm sorry," she stammered, turning back to the espresso machine. "That was inappropriate. I'll get your coffee." But Marcus didn't move. For reasons he couldn't quite explain, he found himself caring about what this stranger thought. "What do you mean, wrong trick?" Sophie bit her lip, her hands shaking harder now as she measured out the coffee grounds. "It's just the way you're doing the French drop. Your grandfather taught you, didn't he? But you're telegraphing it. Your thumb moves half a second too early, and your eyes follow the fake transfer. Anyone really watching would catch it." Marcus stood completely still. "How could you possibly know my grandfather taught me?" Sophie finally turned to face him, and he saw tears forming in her eyes. "Because my grandfather taught me the same trick. And he taught me that magic isn't about fooling people with your hands. It's about connecting with them through wonder. You're performing like you're trying to prove something, like you're checking a box. That's not magic. That's just mechanical." Something cracked in Marcus's chest, a fissure in the armor he'd been building for 15 years. He thought about his grandfather, gone 10 years now, who'd spent hours teaching him card tricks and coin manipulations in the small apartment in Queens where Marcus had grown up. His grandfather had been a janitor who performed magic at children's hospitals on weekends, bringing joy to dying kids for free. Magic is the only honest thing in the world, he used to say, because everyone knows it's a trick, but they choose to be amazed anyway. When had Marcus stopped choosing amazement? When had everything become a transaction? Show me, he said quietly, slipping his phone into his pocket for the first time in years during his morning routine. Show me the right way. Sophie hesitated, then pulled out a quarter from the tip jar with shaking hands. Her grandfather had died 3 years ago, and she hadn't performed a single trick since his funeral. It hurt too much, reminded her too much of the dreams she'd abandoned, the life of discovery and wonder she'd left behind for the brutal mathematics of survival. But something about this moment felt important. Though she couldn't say why, she began the French drop, but differently than Marcus had done it. Her movements were slower, more deliberate, and most importantly, she looked Marcus directly in the eyes as her hands moved. She talked to him softly about her grandfather, about how he'd worked at a hospital cafeteria, but knew the names of every sick child on the pediatric floor. How he'd taught her that magic was about making someone forget their pain for just a moment, about creating a pocket of impossible in a world that often felt too real, too hard, too unforgiving. As she spoke, the quarter genuinely seemed to vanish, then reappear behind Marcus's ear. But what really disappeared was the distance between two strangers, the walls that separated a CEO from a cashier, the barriers that convinced people their pain and dreams and losses were theirs alone to carry. Marcus found himself telling her about his grandfather, about the coin tricks in that small apartment, about how he'd promised the old man he'd never forget where he came from, never forget that success wasn't measured in dollars, but in the lives you touched. When had he broken that promise? When had he stopped looking people in the eye? They talked for 23 minutes. Marcus's phone buzzed 14 times with increasingly urgent messages about the merger, about the 9 a.m. deadline, about the $200 million waiting for his signature. He ignored every single one. Sophie told him about her mother's cancer, about dropping out of her PhD program where she'd been researching neural pathways related to memory and learning. She'd been so close to a breakthrough, her advisor had said, something that could help Alzheimer's patients recover lost memories. But what good were breakthroughs when you couldn't pay for your mother's chemotherapy? Marcus listened in a way he hadn't listened to another human being in years. Really listened, not just waiting for his turn to speak or calculating how to turn the conversation to his advantage. And in that listening, something fundamental shifted in his understanding of what mattered. At 7:38 a.m., his phone rang with a call he couldn't ignore, his CFO, frantic. The merger was falling apart. The other company had discovered a discrepancy in the contract, a clause that could cost them millions in liability. They were threatening to walk away from the entire deal. Marcus needed to get to the office immediately. Marcus looked at Sophie, then at his phone, then made a decision that every advisor would have called insane. "Tell them I'll be there at 10, he said, "and tell them to pull research files on neural pathway restoration and Alzheimer's treatment. Everything we have." His CFO sputtered in disbelief, but Marcus had already hung up. He turned to Sophie. "You said you were close to a breakthrough. Explain it to me. All of it." For the next hour and 17 minutes, Sophie explained her research while Marcus took notes on napkins. She drew diagrams of neural networks, talked about memory consolidation and synaptic plasticity, described the experiments she'd been running before she'd had to abandon everything. Her hands stopped shaking. Her eyes lit up with the fire of someone discussing their true calling, their reason for existing. Marcus saw something in her research that she couldn't see from inside it, a potential application to cybersecurity. Neural network models that could predict and prevent memory-based attacks on systems. It was revolutionary. It was worth more than $200 million. It was worth everything. But more than that, it reminded him why he'd gotten into technology in the first place. Not to accumulate wealth, but to solve problems that mattered, to help people, to create wonder in a world that desperately needed it. At 9:47 a.m., Marcus finally arrived at his office. The merger partners were furious, ready to walk. His entire board of directors looked at him like he'd lost his mind. The $200 million deal was effectively dead. Marcus didn't care. Instead, he made an announcement that caused his CFO to actually gasp out loud. TechVault would be pivoting part of its research division to medical technology, specifically neural pathway restoration. They would be funding a new lab, fully equipped, with a research director who would have complete autonomy and unlimited resources. And he knew exactly who that director would be, if she'd accept the position. The room erupted in chaos. They'd just lost the biggest deal in company history, and Marcus was proposing to spend millions on research that had nothing to do with their core business. His board members threatened to vote him out. His investors threatened to pull funding. Everything he'd built for 15 years was suddenly in jeopardy, but Marcus Chen, who'd spent 15 years playing it safe and building walls and forgetting to look people in the eye, finally remembered his grandfather's real lesson. Magic isn't about the trick. It's about choosing to be amazed. It's about connection. It's about creating moments of impossible in a world that tells us to be practical, to be safe, to protect what we have instead of risking it for what could be. He called Sophie from his office. She answered on the second ring, having just gotten off her shift, exhausted and assuming she'd probably be fired for talking so long to a customer on her first day. "I have a job offer for you," Marcus said. "Research director, full salary, benefits that will cover any medical treatment your mother needs, and complete freedom to pursue your work." "There's just one condition," Sophie's heart hammered. "What condition?" "Teach me magic again. The real way, every morning, 7 a.m., so I don't forget again what matters." Sophie started crying right there on the bus heading to the hospital to visit her mother. Not tears of sadness this time, but of relief, of possibility, of a future she'd thought was dead suddenly blazing back to life. 3 years later, Sophie's research led to a breakthrough treatment that helped restore memory function in early-stage Alzheimer's patients. TechVault's medical division became more profitable than their entire cybersecurity operation. Marcus's board members, who'd threatened to oust him, admitted they'd been wrong. The company's value had increased by over $3 billion, but that's not what Marcus considered his real success. His real success was measured in the hundreds of families who got more time with loved ones whose memories had been fading. It was measured in the morning rituals at the coffee shop where he and Sophie still met, where he'd learned to perform magic not as a mechanical routine, but as a genuine moment of connection. It was measured in the fact that he'd learned to look people in the eye again, to see them as humans rather than transactions, to choose amazement over cynicism. The merger that fell apart that morning? The company that walked away eventually collapsed due to the very vulnerabilities their deal would have exposed TechVault to. Marcus had unknowingly saved his company by losing that deal, but more importantly, he'd saved himself. On the 3-year anniversary of their meeting, Marcus performed the French drop for Sophie one more time. But this time he did it right. He looked her in the eyes. He made it about connection, not performance. And when the quarter disappeared, they both chose to be amazed, even though they both knew exactly how the trick worked, because that's the real magic, isn't it? Knowing something is impossible, but choosing to believe in it anyway. Knowing the world is hard and unfair, but choosing to care anyway. Knowing you could protect yourself, but choosing to risk connection anyway. "Your grandfather would be proud," Sophie said softly. "So would yours," Marcus replied. And in that moment, in a coffee shop where a minimum wage cashier had told a millionaire CEO he was doing magic wrong, they both understood that the greatest trick of all is convincing yourself that what you've lost is more important than what you might find if you're brave enough to look up from your phone, meet someone's eyes and really see them. The wrong trick wasn't about hand movements or timing. The wrong trick was believing that success, real success, could be measured in dollars instead of connections, in transactions instead of transformations, in safety instead of the terrifying, beautiful risk of being fully human. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Tell me about a time when a stranger changed your life, or when you chose connection over convenience, or when you remembered what really mattered. And please hit that like button, share this story with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to Trillionaire in Love, where we explore the real wealth that comes from human connection, from choosing love over fear, from performing the right magic in a world that's forgotten how to be amazed. Thank you for being here, for choosing to listen, for choosing to believe that impossible things can happen when we're brave enough to see each other clearly.